1.17th, 1975, the black-clad liberators. On the morning of April 17th, 1975, the shelling around Phnom Penh finally stopped. A strange, expectant silence fell over the war-torn city, swollen with millions of refugees. Then came the sounds of marching feet and rumbling trucks. The Khmer Rouge had arrived. They were young, mostly teenagers, dressed in simple black pajamas, checkered scarves, and Ho Chi Minh sandals made from tires. They carried Chinese assault rifles and wore unnervingly blank expressions. Initially, the city's residents, exhausted by 5 years of civil war and American bombing, greeted them with cautious relief. Some waved white cloths in surrender and welcome, believing peace had finally come. The soldiers were their countrymen after all, but the relief was short-lived. There were no victory parades, no smiles. The soldiers were disciplined, silent, and cold. Their first orders, delivered through loudspeakers and at gunpoint, were simple, unbelievable, and absolute. Leave the city now. Everyone must leave. Angkar has ordered it. The nightmare had not ended. It was just beginning. 2. Year Zero. Erasing the past. The order to evacuate the cities was the first step in the Khmer Rouge's radical master plan, the implementation of Year Zero. This was not just a political revolution, it was an attempt to reset human history itself. The leader, Saloth Sar, now known by his nom de guerre Pol Pot, and his inner circle of French-educated ideologues, envisioned a complete and total purification of society. Everything that constituted the old Cambodia was deemed corrupt, bourgeois, and contaminated by foreign influence. History, culture, tradition, and personal memory were to be wiped clean. The calendar was reset to Year Zero. The nation was renamed Democratic Kampuchea. The goal was to forge a new type of human being, a homogeneous, classless, purely Khmer peasant, loyal only to the revolutionary state, known simply as Angkar, the organization. To achieve this, the entire structure of society had to be leveled, and anyone who represented the old world had to be physically eliminated. 3. The Death March. The evacuation of the cities. The evacuation was swift and brutal. Within hours, over 2 million people were forced from their homes in Phnom Penh, with similar scenes unfolding in Battambang and other towns. The Khmer Rouge offered a lie as justification. The Americans are about to bomb the city. It was a cruel deception to ensure compliance. The exodus was a vision of hell. The sick were pushed from hospitals, some still attached to intravenous drips. The elderly and infants who could not keep pace were left to die on the roadside under the blistering sun. The streets were littered with abandoned cars, possessions, and the bodies of those who had been shot for refusing to leave or for moving too slowly. It was a chaotic, horrifying river of humanity flowing out of the cities and into a countryside they did not know. This forced march was a deliberate strategy. It served to break the spirit of the population, sever all ties to their former lives, and immediately establish Angkar's absolute and merciless authority. 4. New people and base people. A society divided. As the city dwellers were herded into the countryside, the Khmer Rouge implemented a rigid and fatal social classification system. The population was divided into 2 distinct groups. The base people, New Khmer, were the rural peasants from areas long under Khmer Rouge control. They were considered the pure, uncorrupted foundation of the revolution. The second group, the New People, New Khmer, also called the April 17th people, were the evacuated city dwellers, the doctors, teachers, lawyers, merchants, soldiers of the former regime, and their families. The New People were viewed as inherently suspect, contaminated by capitalism, foreign education, and lazy city life. They were the class enemy. This distinction was a death sentence for many. New People received smaller food rations, were assigned the hardest labor, and were the first to be watched, interrogated, and smashed for the slightest infraction. 5. Angkar's all-seeing eye. The omnipresent state. In democratic Kampuchea, the individual ceased to exist. All loyalty was directed towards Angkar, the organization. Angkar was intentionally kept faceless and mysterious. It was an omniscient, godlike entity that issued all commands, controlled all food, and held the power of life and death. People spoke of it in hushed, fearful tones. Angkar has ordered us to move. Angkar requires more work. This abstraction of power was a powerful tool of psychological control. There was no single person to appeal to or reason with, only the infallible and inescapable will of the organization. A common saying captured the pervasive paranoia: Angkar has the eyes of a pineapple, meaning it could see everything from all directions. Cadres, often uneducated and brutalized teenagers, acted as the local enforcers of Angkar's will, their authority absolute and their cruelty unchecked. 6. The abolition of society. Family, money, and faith. To build their utopia, the Khmer Rouge systematically dismantled every pillar of human society. Money was abolished, banknotes were declared worthless, and littered the empty city streets. Markets were closed, private property was eliminated. Everything belonged to Angkar. The family unit, seen as a bastion of old-world sentimentality and loyalty, was deliberately shattered. Children were separated from their parents and sent to special labor brigades, where they were indoctrinated to spy on their own families. Angkar is my mother and father, they were taught to say. Communal dining was enforced, with meager portions of watery rice soup borer doled out from a collective pot, further eroding family intimacy. Romantic love was forbidden, and marriages were arranged by Angkar based on labor needs. Religion was declared a poison. Monks were forcibly defrocked and murdered. Temples were desecrated and turned into prisons or granaries, and all forms of worship were punishable by death. 7. Life in the cooperatives, a nation of slaves. The entire country was transformed into a massive network of agricultural cooperatives, which were effectively forced labor camps. The daily routine was grueling and monotonous. The workday began before dawn and ended after dusk, often 12 to 14 hours long, 7 days a week. The work was back-breaking manual labor, digging irrigation canals, clearing forests, and planting rice, often with primitive tools. The Khmer Rouge had grandiose plans to triple rice production, but their policies were disastrous. They forced people to build dams and canals with no engineering knowledge, many of which collapsed. They ignored traditional planting cycles, leading to crop failure. The promise of an agricultural paradise became a reality of endless, pointless toil under the watch of armed guards. Exhaustion was a constant state of being, a tool to keep the population too weak to resist. 8. The Great Famine. Starvation as a weapon. While the population toiled to grow rice, they were systematically starved. The famine that swept democratic Kampuchea was not solely the result of failed agricultural policies. It was a deliberate instrument of control and genocide. Angkar controlled all food distribution. Rations were minuscule, often just a small can of thin rice porridge a day, insufficient to sustain a person doing hard labor. The best food was reserved for Khmer Rouge cadres. The new people received the smallest portions, accelerating their demise. Foraging for food, catching a frog, picking a wild banana was considered a crime against the collective and was punishable by death. Starvation became the leading cause of death. People wasted away, their bodies skeletal, their bellies bloated from malnutrition. It was a slow, agonizing execution method that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and demonstrated Angkar's ultimate power, the power to decide who ate and who starved. 9. The War on Knowledge. To keep you is no gain. The Khmer Rouge harbored a deep and pathological hatred for intellectuals and professionals. Pol Pot's ideology dictated that the pure peasant was the ideal citizen, while educated individuals were a threat, capable of critical thought and resistance. A systematic hunt began for anyone connected to the old world of knowledge. Doctors, teachers, engineers, lawyers, artists, and students were targeted for extermination. The purges were sweeping and indiscriminate. Merely wearing glasses was seen as a sign of being an intellectual and could be a death sentence. Speaking a foreign language, having soft hands, or showing any sign of a non-agrarian background marked a person for death. The regime's chilling slogan regarding the new people summarized their philosophy: to keep you is no gain, to destroy you is no loss. With this, Cambodia's intellectual and professional classes were almost completely annihilated. 10. The assault on culture, silent temples and smashed statues. The war on the past extended to the very soul of Khmer culture. More than 1,400 temples and pagodas were destroyed. Priceless ancient statues of the Buddha were smashed or beheaded. Libraries were burned, their books turned to ash. The Royal University of Fine Arts was closed, its dancers, musicians, and artists hunted down and killed. The classical Cambodian ballet, an art form centuries old and central to Khmer identity, was nearly extinguished, with an estimated 90% of its masters perishing. The vibrant Western-influenced music scene of 1960s Phnom Penh, led by icons like Shin Sisamouth, was silenced forever. By destroying the physical and human repositories of culture, the Khmer Rouge sought to create a cultural vacuum, a blank slate upon which they could write their new, brutalist identity, free from the beauty and complexity of the past. 11. The ideology of purity, paranoia and xenophobia. The genocide was fueled by a paranoid ideology obsessed with purity. Pol Pot and his circle believed the Cambodian revolution was under constant threat from enemies both without and within. This paranoia was intensely xenophobic. The country's ethnic Vietnamese minority was targeted with particular viciousness, accused of being a cancer and a fifth column for Cambodia's hereditary enemy, Vietnam. The Cham Muslims were also singled out for persecution. Their language and religious practices were banned, and they were forced to eat pork, with entire villages being massacred for resisting. But the paranoia was most acute when directed inward. The regime was obsessed with finding hidden enemies and traitors burrowing within the party itself. This led to wave after wave of brutal internal purges, as Angkar began to devour its own children in a desperate search for an unattainable ideological purity. 12. The killing fields, the mechanics of mass murder. When a person was marked for death, they were often told they were being re-educated or transferred to a new work site. They were taken away at night in trucks to one of the hundreds of execution sites scattered across the country, now known as the killing fields. To save precious ammunition, the executions were carried out with crude instruments, pickaxes, iron bars, sharpened bamboo sticks, or the back of an axe handle. Victims were forced to kneel at the edge of mass graves before being bludgeoned to death. To drown out the sounds of the killing, loud revolutionary songs were often played through speakers. The most chilling sites contained magic trees, against which the heads of infants and children were smashed, as the Khmer Rouge believed in eliminating entire families to prevent future revenge. These fields of bones are the most visceral and enduring testament to the regime's barbarity. 13. Cess 21, the antechamber of hell. At the very heart of the Khmer Rouge's security apparatus was a secret interrogation and torture center in Phnom Penh, codenamed S21. It was established in a former high school, Tuol Svai Pre, which was renamed Tuol Sleng, meaning Hill of the Poisonous Trees. This was not a place for common criminals or new people. S21 was primarily designed to process and eliminate suspected traitors from within the Khmer Rouge's own ranks. As the regime's paranoia intensified, thousands of party cadres, soldiers, and government ministers, along with their innocent families, were sent to S21. Of the estimated 17,000 to 20,000 people imprisoned there, only a dozen are known to have survived. It was a meticulously organized factory of death, dedicated to proving the existence of vast internal conspiracies, real or imagined. 14. The confession machine, bureaucracy and torture. S21 operated with chilling, bureaucratic precision under the command of Kang Kek Yew, known as Comrade Dutch. Upon arrival, each prisoner was photographed, their life story documented in detail before the torture began. The goal of the torture was not just to inflict pain, but to extract a confession. Prisoners were subjected to horrific methods: electrocution, waterboarding, having their fingernails pulled out, being hung upside down, and being beaten into unconsciousness. Under this duress, They would confess to being spies for the CIA, the KGB, or Vietnam, and would be forced to name their co-conspirators. These names would then lead to new arrests, feeding a relentless, ever-expanding cycle of purges. The confessions, often running for hundreds of pages, were pure fiction, elaborate fantasies dictated by the torturers to satisfy the paranoid delusions of the party leadership. 15. Choeung Ek, the final destination. Once a prisoner at S21 had been tortured and their confession was deemed complete, they were marked for disposal. They were blindfolded, loaded onto trucks, and driven 17 kilometers southwest of Phnom Penh to an orchard that would become the execution site of Choeung Ek. This was the final destination for almost all of S21's victims. The methods were the same as in other killing fields: bludgeoning to save bullets, with DDT scattered over the bodies to mask the smell of decomposition and to kill any victims who might have been buried alive. Today, a memorial stupa at Choeung Ek houses over 8,000 human skulls, sorted by age and sex, a silent, horrifying monument to the state-sponsored murder that was perfected at S21 and carried out in this once peaceful orchard. 16. The Purges. The revolution eats itself. By 1977, the paranoia of the Khmer Rouge leadership had reached a fever pitch. Pol Pot saw traitors everywhere. The regime launched a series of ferocious internal purges to eliminate any potential rivals. Entire military divisions and regional administrative zones were targeted. The most brutal purge was directed at the Eastern Zone, an area bordering Vietnam that was considered contaminated by Vietnamese influence. Cadres from the Eastern Zone were accused of having Khmer bodies but Vietnamese minds. The leadership sent forces from the Southwest Zone, known for their extreme brutality, to cleanse the region. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Zone cadres, soldiers, and civilians were systematically rounded up and massacred in 1978. This self-inflicted wound crippled the Khmer Rouge military and demonstrated the regime's fundamentally self-destructive nature. 17. Child soldiers, a stolen generation. The Khmer Rouge placed immense faith in children, viewing them as the purest and most malleable element of the revolution. They were ideal recruits, untainted by the old society, easily indoctrinated and desensitized to violence. Children as young as 10 were conscripted, separated from their families, and taught that Angkar was their only parent. They were armed and used as guards, spies, and executioners. Having known nothing but brutality, they often became the most cruel and merciless cadreurs, capable of torturing and killing adults without hesitation. They spied on their elders, reporting any critical remarks or infractions, which would lead to the accused being taken away. This weaponization of youth destroyed a generation, turning children into instruments of terror and leaving them with deep psychological wounds that would last a lifetime. 18. Desperate resistance and the will to survive. Organized resistance against the Khmer Rouge was nearly impossible. The regime's total control over food, movement, and information, combined with its network of spies and overwhelming brutality, meant that any uprising was swiftly and mercilessly crushed. Starvation and exhaustion left the general population too weak to fight back. Yet resistance took other forms. It was the desperate act of a mother trying to find an extra frog to feed her starving child. It was the secret preservation of a family photo. It was the quiet sharing of information between trusted friends. The ultimate act of resistance was simply the will to survive, to endure one more day of back-breaking labor and near starvation in the hope, however faint, that the nightmare would one day end. For most, this hope was all they had. 19. The fatal miscalculation. The war with Vietnam. The Khmer Rouge's extreme nationalism and racial hatred were ultimately the seeds of their own destruction. Obsessed with reclaiming the Mekong Delta, Kampuchea Krom, which they considered ancestral Khmer land, the regime began launching a series of bloody, unprovoked cross-border raids into Vietnam, starting in 1977. In raids like the Ba Chook massacre in 1978, Khmer Rouge soldiers slaughtered over 3,000 Vietnamese civilians with horrifying brutality. Pol Pot foolishly believed his ideologically pure peasant army could defeat the battle-hardened Vietnamese military. These attacks, combined with the flood of Cambodian refugees fleeing the Eastern Zone purges, including future leader Hun Sen, gave Vietnam the justification it needed to act. After repeated diplomatic warnings were ignored, Vietnam decided to end the threat on its border once and for all. 20. January 7th, 1979. Liberation and discovery. On December 25th, 1978, the Vietnamese army launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, weakened by years of internal purges, collapsed with surprising speed. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese tanks rolled into a deserted, ghostly Phnom Penh. Pol Pot and the remnants of his regime fled west to the jungles along the Thai border, where they would wage a guerrilla war for 2 more decades. For the Cambodian people, it was the end of the genocide. Starving, skeletal survivors began a long, slow trek back to their home villages, searching for lost family members. As the country opened up, the world discovered the full, unimaginable horror of what had occurred: the empty cities, the mass graves of the killing fields, and the chilling archives of Tuol Sleng. The 4-year nightmare was over, but the long, painful process of counting the dead, healing the living, and understanding the madness had just begun.